She snapped the cuffs onto his wrists, certain that no one would dare question her word. But when he stepped into the courtroom, she realized she had made the biggest mistake of her career. Elijah Brooks had always been someone who avoided trouble. His life was structured. Careful, he was not the type to take risks. But none of that mattered when Officer Lauren Mitchell walked into the convenience store on a quiet afternoon in Nashville, Tennessee. The store was nearly empty. Elijah had stopped by just to grab some coffee and a quick snack before heading home. He had just stepped away from the self-checkout when he felt that sharp, uneasy sensation, like someone was watching him. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." The voice was cold, authoritative. Elijah turned, confused, and found himself facing a uniformed female officer, her hand resting lightly on the holster of her gun. Officer Mitchell. He glanced around, sure there had to be some kind of misunderstanding. "Is there a problem?" Her expression was unreadable, but her stance made it clear she had already made up her mind. "I just saw you put something in your pocket after scanning a few items. Can you show me your receipt?" Elijah frowned, shifting his bag to his other hand. "I just paid. You can check the register." Mitchell pressed her lips together, her gaze unwavering. "I said, let me see the receipt." Elijah took a slow breath, reached into the plastic bag, and pulled out the small slip of paper. Keeping his movements calm, he handed it to her. Mitchell snatched it from his hand, glanced at it quickly, then shook her head. "Nice try. Turn out your pockets." A few people in the store had started paying attention, their eyes darting between the two of them, watching like spectators at a match. Elijah kept his voice steady. "I don't have anything in my pockets." Mitchell's patience seemed to snap. "Hands on the counter, now." Elijah clenched his jaw. This wasn't about a missing item. She hadn't even really checked the receipt. He had seen this happen too many times, in too many places, to too many people who looked like him. "I already told you I didn't take anything," he said, keeping his voice controlled. Mitchell reached for her radio. "I have a shoplifting suspect refusing to comply." Refusing to comply. Elijah exhaled slowly. He was standing still, his hands visible, his voice calm, but none of that mattered. A store employee, a young man in uniform, hesitated before stepping forward. I actually saw him pay for everything." Mitchell didn't even turn her head. "Stay out of this." Elijah's heart pounded. He could already see how this was going to play out. "Listen, you're making a mistake," he said firmly. "I have a law degree. I know my rights." Mitchell let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah? Then you can explain your rights down at the station." Before Elijah could react, she grabbed his wrist. In that brief moment as her fingers tightened around him, a choice flashed in his mind: pull away, demand a superior, resist. But none of those options would end well for him. So he let her cuff him. The cold metal clamped around his wrist, sending a ripple of tension through the small store. Mitchell gripped his arm tightly as she led him toward the exit, where a patrol car was waiting. As Elijah caught his own reflection in the glass doors, he thought about how many times he had seen others in this exact position. But this time he was one of them. And there was one thing Lauren Mitchell didn't know. This wasn't going to end the way she thought it would. The ride to the station was silent, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio. Elijah sat in the back seat, hands cuffed, watching the city blur past the window. He knew better than to say anything. Anything he said would be twisted, misinterpreted, and used against him. Mitchell, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease. One hand rested on the wheel, the other near the radio. It was clear she had done this before, probably too many times to count. When they arrived at the station, she parked with the confidence of someone who thought they had everything under control. She stepped out, opened the back door, and gestured as if she had just captured her prey. "Let's go." Elijah didn't resist. He stepped out of the car, head held high, jaw clenched. Inside, the other officers barely glanced up as Mitchell led him past the front desk. "Shoplifting," she said simply, tossing his wallet and personal belongings onto the counter. The desk officer, a tired-looking man with graying hair, gave her a skeptical look. "Really?" Mitchell just shrugged. Had to detain him. He started getting aggressive. Elijah clenched his fists. Aggressive? He hadn't even raised his voice. But that word meant something different when it was applied to someone like him. A younger officer, probably in his early 30s, flipped through Elijah's wallet and pulled out a bar association card. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Elijah exhaled through his nose. "Yes." Mitchell scoffed. "Yeah, sure you are." The younger officer turned the card over, his eyes narrowing. "He's telling the truth." He glanced at Mitchell. "You sure about this charge?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. "I saw him stealing." The younger officer hesitated, then looked back at Elijah. "Do you have an attorney?" Elijah looked the officer straight in the eye. "I don't need one." "One." A smirk flickered across the officer's face. He glanced at Mitchell, then handed Elijah's wallet back to him. "You're representing yourself?" Elijah nodded. "Exactly." Mitchell huffed and turned away. "Book him." Elijah was led through the holding cells, the same ones where he had once defended others. Now he was the one waiting. They would keep him locked up as long as possible, pressure him into pleading guilty, or hold him over the weekend to teach him a lesson. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. The door swung open. A guard stepped inside. "You'll be in court tomorrow morning." Elijah nodded. He wasn't just going to prove his innocence, he was going to make sure this never happened to anyone else. In court. The courtroom was cold. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the judge's bench. Elijah sat at the defendant's table, the memory of the handcuffs from the night before still fresh in his mind. Across from him, Officer Lauren Mitchell stood tall, exuding confidence. To her, this was just another routine arrest. She hadn't even bothered to read the defendant's name. The judge, an older woman with a sharp gaze, spoke. "Charges?" The prosecutor, a young man with a smug smile, stood. Elijah Brooks was caught shoplifting. Officer Mitchell witnessed it firsthand. Elijah shook his head slightly. The lies had started from the very beginning. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Brooks, do you have legal representation?" Elijah rose to his feet, slowly fastening the button on his suit jacket. "Your Honor, I will be representing myself." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor hesitated, momentarily thrown off. But Mitchell remained stone-faced. The judge nodded. "Very well." The room fell silent. "Mr. Brooks, how do you plead?" "Not guilty," Elijah said firmly. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Let's hear the officer's testimony." Mitchell stepped forward, radiating confidence. "I saw the defendant place merchandise in his bag without paying. When I asked for a receipt, he was unable to provide one, became argumentative, and refused to cooperate." Elijah tilted his head slightly, his voice calm. "Does the store have security cameras?" Mitchell hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Yes, but they haven't been reviewed yet." He turned to the prosecutor. "Did you request the footage?" The prosecutor shifted in his seat. "We didn't deem it necessary." Elijah let a brief silence settle before continuing. "Officer, you claim I refused to comply. In what way, specifically?" Mitchell squared her shoulders. "You were aggressive, refused to empty your bag, and resisted arrest." Elijah gave a small nod before looking directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit A, my receipt, which was in my possession at the time of my arrest." The judge examined it. "This receipt confirms that Mr. Brooks paid for his items." She turned her sharp gaze to Mitchell. "Did you check for this?" Mitchell stiffened. "I may have overlooked it." Elijah met her eyes. "Are you sure about that?" The tension in the room was palpable. He continued. "Did your body camera record the incident?" Mitchell hesitated. "My camera was malfunctioning." The judge narrowed her eyes. "Why wasn't that reported?" Elijah crossed his arms. No body cam footage, no security footage, and the receipt was ignored. He let out a small chuckle. "Officer Mitchell, did you actually see me steal, or did you just assume I looked like the type?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Mitchell clenched her fists, her face turning red. But Elijah knew this was just the beginning. Keeping his voice calm, he continued. "Officer Mitchell, you said I was aggressive and uncooperative, correct?" Mitchell lifted her chin. "Correct." "What specific actions did I take?" She hesitated. "You refused to empty your pockets. You raised your voice." Mitchell remained silent. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit B, a video statement from the store employee. The prosecutor objected, but the judge overruled it. The video played. I saw everything. He paid in full. The officer barely looked before approaching him. She didn't even check the cameras. The courtroom fell into a hush. Elijah turned to Mitchell. Did you speak to the store employee before arresting me? Mitchell clenched her jaw. Or did you assume I was guilty the moment you saw me? Elijah crossed his arms. No security footage, no body cam evidence, no witnesses, just your word against mine. But I have a receipt, a witness, and, he turned to the judge, I request a review of Officer Mitchell's prior arrests. The prosecutor shot up. Objection. That's irrelevant. Elijah smiled. On the contrary, if she has a history of wrongful arrests, that is highly relevant. The judge nodded. Overruled. A screen displayed Mitchell's record. Elijah looked at her. Officer Mitchell, have you ever been accused of wrongful arrests? Mitchell's face paled. No. Elijah nodded. Really? Because your record shows 3 racial discrimination complaints in just the past 2 years. The courtroom buzzed. Elijah met her gaze. How many of those cases involved black men? Mitchell's fist tightened. That's irrelevant. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Irrelevant? She shot a glance at the prosecutor, but he only rubbed his temples, clearly regretting bringing this case to trial. Elijah let the silence hang before speaking again. Your Honor, it's clear that I was wrongfully arrested and that Officer Mitchell acted on bias. I move to have this case dismissed immediately. The judge didn't hesitate. Motion granted. Case dismissed. Elijah exhaled. He had won, but this wasn't over. Officer Mitchell was about to face much bigger consequences. The judge's gavel struck. Mitchell remained frozen, but Elijah caught a flicker of panic in her eyes. She had walked in expecting an easy conviction. Now, she was the one under scrutiny. As Elijah gathered his belongings, the judge's voice rang out. Before we adjourn, Officer Mitchell, I am recommending an internal investigation into your conduct in this case, as well as your prior complaints. Mitchell's face went ghostly pale. Your Honor, that won't be necessary. The judge raised a hand. That is not for you to decide. Elijah stepped forward, his tone steady. You were so quick to judge me without even checking the facts. You let your bias dictate your actions. But what about the people who can't fight back like I did? Mitchell didn't answer. The question lingered in the air, heavy and damning. The courtroom doors swung open. A police official stepped in, whispered something to the judge, and then she turned to Mitchell. Officer Mitchell, you are hereby placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. Mitchell stood in shock. This isn't fair, she blurted. Elijah smirked. Neither was my arrest. The room was silent. Mitchell was escorted out, her face pale. Elijah picked up his briefcase, running a hand over the smooth leather. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was an important step forward. He stepped out of the courthouse and took a deep breath. The air felt fresher today. Maybe the world hadn't changed, but at least one person had been forced to see it differently. A voice cut through his thoughts. Mr. Brooks. Elijah turned to see the young officer, the one who had hesitated when Mitchell searched his wallet, standing there, slightly out of breath. I just wanted to say what you did in there that was incredible. Elijah raised an eyebrow. The officer scratched the back of his neck, looking uncertain. I see this all the time, people getting arrested for no reason, trapped because they can't defend themselves. But no one has ever turned the tables like you did. Elijah studied him. Have you ever spoken up? The officer clenched his jaw. That's not easy. Elijah nodded. Proving my innocence wasn't easy either. The officer was silent. Elijah continued. Things change when someone dares to speak up. The young man hesitated, then spoke softly. Not everyone on the force is like Mitchell. Elijah held his gaze for a long moment. Then prove it. The officer gave a small nod before disappearing into the crowd. Elijah remained still, knowing this fight wasn't over. There were many who didn't have the chance to defend themselves and that needed to change. He pulled out his phone and dialed. A woman's voice answered. "Elijah, is everything okay?" He smiled slightly. "I'm fine, Mom. I know what I want to do next." "And what's that?" He watched the people passing by. "I want to start a legal defense fund to help those who can't fight for themselves." His mother was quiet for a moment before she spoke gently. "That's a big thing, sweetheart." Elijah chuckled softly. "But I know it's the right thing." She let out a small sigh, then said, "I think you're right." Elijah slipped his phone into his pocket. He had walked into that courthouse as a defendant, but when he walked out, he had become something else, something greater. Because today wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about ensuring that the next person falsely accused wouldn't have to fight alone. And that was a battle worth fighting. Elijah Brooks's story is not just a journey to clear his name, it is a voice for those who never get the chance to defend themselves. It reveals that justice is not always fair, but sometimes all it takes is one person to stand up for change to begin. Elijah did not stop after his personal victory. Instead, he chose a greater path, establishing a legal defense fund for the vulnerable. This reminds us that justice does not come naturally, it must be fought for and protected. But in 2025, what will we do? Criticize or take action? And by 2030, will racism disappear? Or will it simply take on a different form? The answer depends on what we do today. As for me, I believe justice can still prevail if enough people are willing to fight for it. What do you think? Share your thoughts, because change begins with our mindset and actions. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of accountability, justice, and the importance of treating others with respect and dignity. We strongly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.